Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever caught yourself thinking about someone day and night without a single message, without a single call, yet they linger in your mind like a song you can't turn off? Strange, isn't it? Our minds, those brilliant engines of logic and emotion, sometimes get hijacked and not by facts, but by feelings. This speech isn't about romance or obsession, it's about the why behind our inner dialogue, the invisible pull that keeps someone alive in our thoughts while they remain absent from our lives. Is it intuition, a lesson, or a warning? Before you label it as foolish or poetic, ask yourself, what if that silence is the greatest teacher you've been ignoring? We're going to break this down like a mystery novel, Act 1, the problem you don't know you're trapped in. Act 2, the emotional battlefield inside your own head. And Act 3, well, let's just say by the end, you'll either walk away lighter or haunted by what you finally understand. And hey, if your brain was a group chat, who keeps texting you without permission? Let's dive in. There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than words. When someone remains in your thoughts without any communication, it's not always about them often, it's about you. More specifically, it's about your subconscious trying to resolve something it never had the chance to finish. The human brain is designed to seek patterns and closure. We are wired to connect the dots, complete stories, and make sense of situations. But when someone disappears from your life without explanation or leaves things unresolved, it's like an unfinished sentence your mind keeps trying to complete. This isn't a conscious choice. You're not obsessing on purpose. You're not weak, desperate, or overly emotional. What's really happening is that your subconscious mind is doing exactly what it's designed to do: protect you. And sometimes protection comes in the form of rumination. Your thoughts cycle back to this person because your inner world is trying to understand why it happened, what it meant, and most of all, what it says about you. Think about a song you only heard half of, a story without an ending, a film that cuts to black in the middle of the climax. That irritation, that need to know, doesn't fade easily. Now multiply that by emotional investment, feelings, memories, dreams. When those threads are suddenly cut off with no explanation, your subconscious doesn't accept the silence as an answer. Instead, it keeps circling back, whispering possibilities, triggering flashbacks, even rewriting memories to create a sense of logic where there is none. It's not love that keeps someone stuck in your mind. It's the lack of resolution. It's the body and brain still holding on to unfinished business. You may believe that thinking about them constantly is proof of some deeper connection, some mystical pull of destiny. But more often than not, it's the echo of a question you never got to ask or the response you never got to give. Your subconscious is trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, and because it can't let go until it does, it keeps placing that person back in front of you again and again. This emotional loop affects more than just your thoughts, it spills over into your behaviors, your sleep, your confidence. You start interpreting random signs as signals, coincidence as meaning. You overanalyze moments from the past, replay conversations, dissect facial expressions. Why? Because your subconscious believes that if it can just figure out the why, you can finally let go. But here's the catch: the answer never comes from the outside. The closure you seek won't come from them. It can't. Not when they're absent, not when communication has ceased. The resolution your mind craves has to come from within. This is the point where many people get stuck. They confuse this emotional loop with a sign that they must reach out, must reconnect, must revisit the story. But acting from this space often leads to more pain, more confusion, more silence. Because the reality is, most people don't walk away with clear reasons or kind explanations. Some exits are quiet. Some people are emotionally unavailable. Some connections were only meant to teach you something before fading out. And that's where your subconscious goes to work, not because it's trying to torture you, but because it's trying to find safety and understanding. When we don't understand why something ended, the mind assumes the worst. It tells us stories like, I wasn't enough, I did something wrong, or maybe they'll come back if I just wait. These narratives aren't truth, they're defense mechanisms. They're your subconscious trying to create closure through imagination. And the longer you stay in this loop, the more real those imagined stories begin to feel. So if you find yourself constantly thinking about someone you're no longer in contact with, stop blaming yourself. This isn't a character flaw, it's a natural response to emotional uncertainty. Your mind is simply trying to finish the story. The key is not to force that closure externally, but to recognize that the thoughts are a signal that there's something inside you that needs attention, not them, you. That emotional loop, those constant thoughts that pull toward the past, it's your subconscious handing you a mirror. It's not asking you to go back, it's asking you to go deeper. Because underneath the obsession, underneath the overthinking, there's likely a wound. Maybe it's abandonment. Maybe it's rejection. Maybe it's the pain of feeling unseen, unheard, or unimportant. Whatever it is, your mind won't stop until you face it, not with logic, but with compassion. When someone is on your mind and there's no communication, it's not always because they're meant to return. Sometimes it's because they left behind an emotional fingerprint you haven't fully understood. Your mind holds on to what it didn't get to heal. And in that space of silence, your subconscious does what it must to protect you from deeper pain. It replays, revisits, and reimagines. Not to punish you, but to guide you towards something more important than answers: emotional freedom. Silence has a way of becoming louder than any conversation when we allow our minds to fill in the blanks with meaning that was never there. When someone is absent and yet constantly present in your thoughts, you may believe it's a sign of destiny or deep emotional connection. But more often, what's really happening is projection. You're not just thinking about the person, you're unconsciously assigning your unmet needs, longings, and unresolved emotions onto the silence they've left behind. In the absence of real interaction, your mind becomes a screen, and silence becomes the canvas on which you paint every hope, fear, and fantasy you haven't yet confronted. This is a deeply human process. We all carry internal needs that we may or may not be aware of: needs for love, safety, validation, connection. When those needs aren't met in our day-to-day lives or relationships, we begin to seek fulfillment in places that feel emotionally charged, even if they're empty in reality. Silence, ironically, becomes a powerful magnet for these unmet needs. It's like a blank page. You can write anything you want on it, and your brain will believe it's true simply because nothing else is being said to contradict it. You start imagining that their silence means they're thinking about you too. You convince yourself that the connection is still alive, that perhaps they're struggling just like you are. You read into dreams, songs, social media posts, anything that could support the story you want to believe. But the truth is, you're filling the quiet with your own desires. You're interpreting nothingness as something meaningful because the alternative, that it truly is just silence, feels too empty, too painful, too unresolved to accept. This kind of projection often begins subtly. Maybe they once made you feel seen or special in a way no one else did. Maybe they sparked a sense of possibility, a version of love or understanding you had long been craving. And when that connection disappeared, the experience didn't vanish with them, it stayed within you, and your subconscious latched onto it. Not because they were perfect or irreplaceable, but because the emotional experience activated something you were already missing. The pain doesn't come solely from their absence. It comes from the gap between what you needed and what was actually delivered. This projection becomes a loop. Every time you think about them, you aren't just remembering them, you're revisiting that unmet need. And because the silence leaves so much room for interpretation, your mind begins to build stories. Stories where they come back, stories where you find out what really happened, stories where you finally feel whole again. But these stories are not based on real, shared communication. They are fantasies driven by internal longing, not external truth. It's important to understand that emotional needs are not weaknesses. Wanting to be loved, valued, and seen is part of being human. But when we allow our unresolved needs to hijack our thoughts, especially in the absence of clarity, we begin to distort reality. We idealize people who gave us only fragments. We romanticize pain. We confuse emotional intensity with genuine connection. And worst of all, we start believing that this internal chaos is evidence of fate or purpose, instead of realizing it's a reflection of our own healing process trying to get our attention. Silence becomes addictive, not because it's comforting, but because it offers endless possibilities. It doesn't tell you no. It doesn't reject you. It doesn't confront you with the truth. And so you can keep your hopes alive inside it undisturbed. But what's the cost of that illusion? Every moment you spend lost in the projections, you drift further from yourself. You delay your own healing. You avoid the very discomfort that could set you free, acknowledging that sometimes people leave and they don't return, and that has nothing to do with your worth. The danger of projecting unmet needs onto silence is that you begin to define yourself by what's missing. You start to believe that the absence itself is meaningful, that your pain is proof of something deeper, when it may only be proof that you haven't yet learned how to meet your own needs. The person in your mind becomes larger than life, not because of who they are, but because of what you've attached to them: hope, closure, validation, even salvation. It's not easy to separate the reality of someone's absence from the fantasy of what they represented. It takes deep honesty to ask yourself whether you're mourning the person or the version of yourself you hope to become with them. Are you missing the connection, or are you missing how they temporarily made you feel whole? When you begin to see the difference, something shifts. The silence no longer becomes a symbol of possibility, it becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, you're not looking at them. You're looking at the part of you still waiting to be chosen, not by someone else, but by yourself. When someone occupies your mind without offering any form of communication, it's natural to feel drawn toward the idea of reaching out, of seeking clarity or closure, of chasing an answer that will finally quiet the noise inside. But what if that noise isn't calling you to go outward at all? What if the signal is pulling you inward, inviting you to stop, sit with yourself, and examine the deeper layers of your own emotional landscape? The mind often tricks us into believing that relief lies in someone else's validation, in rekindling a lost connection, or in receiving the words we were never given. But the truth is, those moments of emotional chaos are not demands to act, they are invitations to reflect. It is easy to believe that the discomfort you feel is caused by the other person. After all, they're the one who's silent. They're the one who walked away, disappeared, or left things open-ended. But discomfort doesn't just come from what others do, it often comes from what we haven't yet faced within ourselves. Their silence becomes a mirror, reflecting the areas in your life that need your attention. It points you not to them, but to the wounds they activated, the needs that went unmet, the fears that were stirred up. And while chasing after them may feel like the obvious solution, it often leads to more confusion, more disappointment, more silence. The reason this happens is because emotional pain doesn't live outside of you, it lives within. So when you chase someone else in hopes of finding peace, you are essentially running away from yourself. You are outsourcing healing to a person who may not even have the tools to give it to you. You're asking for answers from someone who already chose not to speak. That isn't strength. That's avoidance disguised as pursuit. And until you pause long enough to realize that, the cycle will keep repeating. Focusing inward requires a kind of bravery most people are never taught. It's not about blaming yourself or pretending you're unaffected. It's about getting honest about what their absence has revealed in you. Maybe it brought up abandonment issues you thought you had overcome. Maybe it exposed a pattern of seeking love from people who are emotionally unavailable. Maybe it reminded you of a parent who was never really present, no matter how much you tried to earn their attention. These insights are not punishments, they are the roots. And if you never go inward to uncover them, you'll keep mistaking the symptoms for the source. When you focus inward, you begin to shift from, "Why won't they talk to me?" to, "Why does their silence hurt this much?" That's a powerful transformation. One question keeps you stuck in someone else's orbit, the other brings you back into your own body, your own truth. And that's where healing starts, not with answers from them, but with deeper awareness in you. It might feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, but discomfort is often the doorway to freedom. You begin to see how often you've made your self-worth dependent on other people's presence, affection, or attention. You notice how rarely you sit with your emotions without trying to escape them. And you realize that the person you've been chasing has always been a placeholder for something much deeper, your own sense of completeness. This process isn't about becoming cold or detached. It's about becoming whole. It's the difference between chasing something to feel loved and learning how to love yourself so completely that you no longer chase. When you go inward, you start asking better questions. What parts of me felt unseen in this connection? What did I crave from them that I can begin to offer myself? What boundaries did I overlook and why? These aren't just self-help prompts, they are life-changing conversations with yourself. And they create the kind of inner clarity that makes you less reactive, less desperate, and far more empowered. You also begin to recognize the power of stillness. The world often equates action with progress, but emotional growth doesn't always look like doing more. Sometimes it looks like doing less chasing, less fixing, less explaining. In that space of less, you find more understanding, more peace, more clarity. And from that place, even if the other person never comes back, never explains, never apologizes, you are no longer waiting. You're not stuck. You've already moved forward, not because they gave you permission, but because you chose to take your power back. When you redirect the energy you are pouring outward into healing the places inside that need it most, the obsession begins to fade. The person no longer holds power over your emotional state. You start making decisions based on truth, not triggers. And what once felt like a painful mystery becomes a meaningful turning point. Not because they changed, but because you did. Because you stopped asking the silence to fill you and started listening to what it was trying to say all along. There's something haunting about an unfinished story. Something in us clings to what could have been, what should have been, and especially to what was never fully explained. Emotional attachment often feels strongest not when everything is said and done, but when it's left hanging in the air, when there's no goodbye, no clarity, no resolution. In that uncertain space, our minds go to work, not to forget, but to preserve. We hold on tighter, not because the connection was necessarily deep or healthy, but because it was incomplete. That lack of closure becomes fertile ground for attachment to grow, fed by questions, fantasies, and the ache of not knowing. Closure is how we make sense of endings. It helps us categorize emotions, understand experiences, and integrate them into the narrative of our lives. When we don't have closure, we can't fully process what happened. We can't say, this chapter is over, because we don't know how or why it ended. That ambiguity traps us in emotional limbo. It's not just about wanting the other person back, it's about wanting the understanding back. We want to know what we meant, why things changed, and if it was ever real. And in that search for answers, emotional attachment digs deeper roots. This is why we often find ourselves fixated on people who ghosted us or left without explanation. They become larger than life in our minds, not because they were perfect, but because they vanished while the emotional story was still unfolding. Our brains don't like gaps in narratives, so they fill those gaps with possibilities, idealizations, and sometimes illusions. The person becomes a symbol, not of who they actually were, but of what we didn't get. We attach not only to them, but to the closure we never received. That craving becomes a loop, and the longer it goes unresolved, the stronger the emotional hold becomes. This kind of attachment doesn't just live in the mind, it lives in the body. You feel it in your chest when you hear their name. You feel it in your stomach when you replay memories. You feel it late at night when silence stretches longer than it should. These aren't just signs of longing, they are symptoms of emotional confusion. And because there was no clear ending, your nervous system still reacts as if the connection is open, as if the next message might come, as if it's not really over. That tension between hope and reality becomes addictive. It keeps you emotionally invested, even in someone who is no longer present. The danger here is that emotional attachment rooted in the absence of closure often distorts memory. You begin to remember only the highlights, filtering out the red flags, the misalignments, the discomforts. Your mind constructs a version of the person based on potential rather than truth. And because you never got a definitive no, you keep wondering if there's still a maybe. This keeps your emotional energy tied up in someone who has already left, robbing you of the space needed to build something new with yourself or with someone else. It's easy to confuse this kind of attachment with real connection. But real connection thrives in presence, not absence. It's nurtured by communication, trust, and mutual effort. When we attach more deeply after someone leaves than we did while they were present, it's usually not about them, it's about what they triggered inside us. They may have tapped into old wounds, insecurities, or unfulfilled desires, and their silence leaves us chasing not just them, but our own sense of worth. We want to feel chosen. We want to feel understood. We want to feel closure not just about the relationship, but about who we are because of it. That's why people often find themselves stuck for months, even years, in emotional attachment to someone who offered no explanation. They're not clinging to a person, they're clinging to a narrative that was never resolved. The pain isn't always about missing that individual. It's about missing peace. And until closure is found, whether through actual conversation or internal acceptance, the attachment can remain strong, sometimes even stronger than it would have been had the relationship ended clearly. This is where self-awareness becomes critical. Recognizing that your emotional intensity might be tied more to the lack of closure than to the person themselves can be freeing. It allows you to separate what's real from what's unresolved. It gives you permission to stop chasing answers and start giving yourself the permission to move forward. You begin to see that waiting for closure from someone else may never bring the relief you're hoping for. Because closure, in its most powerful form, doesn't come from their explanation, it comes from your decision to end the story in your own heart. Emotional attachment thrives in the absence of closure because the mind wants to complete what the heart never got to finish. But the longer you wait for someone else to hand you that ending, the more you delay your own peace. Sometimes the hardest part isn't letting go of the person, it's letting go of the version of the story you never got to live.